Good morning, First and Calvary family. This is Pastor Ernest. For those of you who have not met me, I'm Reverend Ernest L. Gardner III. I have the joy and privilege of being the transitional pastor here for this season of transition at First and Calvary, and serve also as the head of staff, working with the staff as the liaison to the session. At this time, this is, I believe, my seventh interim call as a transitional pastor. I had served two other calls as the installed pastor. I think part of my story begins right there. I had the joy of serving three rural congregations in rural Virginia, west of Richmond, Virginia. And it was a great time of, I had a colleague who said that he cut his teeth in ministry in that area. He was coming from another denomination, and I met him on a visit one day. Well, what I learned in that first call and what I learned in my second call as the installed pastor, in some ways, was the importance and the value of solid transitional leadership. I had followed interim pastors in both those calls where I served as the installed pastor. And for whatever reason, there were challenges that those transitional or interim pastors did not address or even get to. In fact, I found as the installed pastor, there was work I had to do to undo what the alleged interim pastor did. So in 2010, I had the opportunity to have my first interim call. And since then, I've served a various number of size churches. And right now, this is my second congregation I've served within the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterians. But a little bit more about me personally. I was born and raised in Virginia. My dad and my grandfather, we have the same name. That's why I'm the third. I was very close to my dad and my grandfather until their deaths. And what a joy it was. When I was a young child, I would sometimes answer the telephone and they would ask for Ernest Gardner. And my 5-year-old voice, I say, "Yes, can I talk to you?" And the gentleman on the phone knew that he didn't want to talk to a 5-year-old, so he said, "Well, can I talk to your dad?" And I gave the phone to my dad, and then the gentleman said, "Could I please speak to Ernest Gardner?" And the topic came up about retirement benefits, and so my dad said, "Oh, well, let me give it to my dad." So sometimes it's rather amusing for someone to make a phone call, ask for one name, and end up with three different people. I'm the youngest of three children. I have two older sisters. One is living in California in Sonoma Valley. Her name is Trudy, and I have a sister, Mary Sue, and she is married and with her husband Peter, and they live in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and have two adult children. As you know, you've met my wife, Ellen. We had quite an interesting journey in our courtship, one that was delayed, and I will hold off on telling my version of that story until she gets to tell her version first. But it makes for quite a great conversation. As a child, I grew up going to church. I went to a church-based nursery school and kindergarten. Our family was very active in a church community until I was in second grade. And for some reason, there was something that happened in our church in second grade, and we stopped going. And I didn't really understand why that happened, but I just remember reading the comics on Sunday more often than going and getting dressed for church. And then we moved into a community where there was this brand new church being built. And at that time, I was about 12 or 13, and I was learning to ride and enjoy my skateboard. And this church had a large parking lot with a pristine asphalt cover on it. And so the pristine black asphalt cover on it. And so it was like the perfect place for someone my age at that time to go skateboarding. And it was not necessarily what the church people wanted me to be doing, but I remember one of the first people I met was actually the pastor of that church. They had a couple pastors. The head of staff, the senior pastor, he had a Volkswagen Bug convertible. And I still remember the sound of that car, as many of you would if you've had that car or had friends who had that automobile as well. And I remember him driving up to me, and then he invited me to church, and he invited me to join one of the young children's choirs. And I said, okay. And I said, I think about that. And lo and behold, in God's good timing, a friend of mine invited me to a Bible study. He didn't say it was a Bible study. He said, "Hey, we're going to go play basketball at the church right behind your house. So come bring your ball." And so I brought my ball, and he kind of he kind of fooled me. Actually, it was not just a Bible. It was not just basketball. It was actually a Bible study, and it was a great time of reawakening to God's love in my life. And so on Sundays, without my parents realizing it, I would start going to church by myself. I'd just get dressed in my school clothes, and I'd skip over the hill behind the lot in our house and go into the parking lot like I would go during the week to go skateboarding and attend worship. And after a couple of weeks, my parents wondered, "Where were you going?" And I finally confessed to them I was going to church. And so what a joy it was for them to follow me as we would rekindle and remember our commitments that we made in faith to Christ, and as God gave us the opportunity to live out our baptism. That was a Baptist church, and through all my high school years, I was a member of a Baptist church. I went to Baptist colleges. I transferred from a school 1 year in Texas after my grandfather's death. Transferred back to Virginia to Liberty. And actually, it was during my time at Liberty I became a Presbyterian. I was attending Rivermont Presbyterian Church, now Rivermont Evangelical Presbyterian Church. If you're familiar with Virginia, there are lots of women's colleges, and there was one named Randolph-Macon Women's College, and just around the corner on Rivermont Avenue was the Presbyterian Church. And that congregation, in a very real way, adopted me and became a church family to me. And if you think about it, that's really significant because I was already in a Christian community at Liberty. I was already part of a Bible study in my dorm. I was already part of a community that we met for chapel 3 times a week, and we met for worship on Wednesday night, Sunday morning, and Sunday night. But it was the ministry of the local church that meant so much to me. It was something humorous because I would tell my friends I would go off on Wednesday nights to have a church meal with the folks there at Rivermont, and I never realized that the caterer that the church used for Wednesday night meals was actually the caterer that provided food at our campus. And so it was kind of funny that I was actually paying money for the food. I thought, this is marvelous, not realizing it was the same food that they were being served on campus. But it had more to do with the community. It had more to do with the people around me. When I was in college, my father had a major heart attack, and I shared with a little bit about that in a children's sermon a couple of weeks ago. And I still have the pillow here that my father received when he received his heart transplant. And my mother at the time, she was going through some mental health issues. So college was really not an easy time for me. It was not necessarily the glory years that some aspire to or think of in those early adult years. But what a joy, what a memory and a testimony of God's work in and through me through the ministry of a local congregation. And so I've always been thankful and appreciative not only for that congregation and what they did for my faith life and my life in general, but also how it helped me understand the importance of congregational worship, the faith community that the congregation establishes, and the faith formation that happens through those relationships. So after college, I went to graduate school. I went to the University of I went to the University of North Texas for singing, and I was at that time singing with a couple of opera companies in the chorus with Houston Grand Opera and the Dallas Opera. And I had a friend in actually the pastor at Rivermont Presbyterian, and I said, I'm going to Texas. Where should I go to church? And he had suggested several places, and one of those places happened to be Highland Park Presbyterian. And at the time, the Reverend Dr. Clayton Bell was pastor there, along with Woody Strudel and Harry Hassel, just incredible people who, again, made such strides in ministry to me. And I was in grad school, so they had an older young person class, and they also had a college and career class, and I was in grad school, so I thought maybe I could be a resource to that class. And it was through the relationships in that class that, in many ways, my life took a different direction. I went to Texas to become a musician and to become really bona fide, a professional. And in many ways, I did. I had great opportunities both in the secular world with the arts community as well as the church community as well. We had multiple ensembles I was involved with there. But it was during that time that God was convicting me that it was as if I was on a train and I was riding on a particular track. Maybe if I've not taken the Amtrak through Missouri, but if there was a train between Oklahoma and Chicago, maybe I'd be riding the train from Springfield to St. Louis. And as if I got to St. Louis and as if the Lord said, well, I want you to get on another track. And it was actually during that time I was taking lessons in New York City with a coach. And I remember being in the Port Authority in New York City, and I just felt the voice of the Lord saying, you've been faithful to this as I've asked you, but now I want you to go into another track. And so that began my process to go to follow the process of ordination. Highland Park Church was very faithful and kind to me in many, many ways. They blessed me in ways I did not expect to be blessed. And along with several of my classmates that we came from Highland Park, and many of those relationships I continue today. I had the great opportunity to be part of a cohort through an organization called the Foundation for Reformed Theology, formed by John Leith, who is a retired emeritus professor from Union Theological Seminary in Virginia. At one point, the foundation decided to create other cohorts, and I had the privilege of starting a cohort among those friends of mine that I knew from Highland Park Presbyterian who are in worship, in ministry today, as well as some that I knew from Austin Presbyterian Seminary. And so we've been meeting for a little bit more than 10 years now, and it's really been quite a joy to gather, and it's been quite a great way to reminisce and see how God has been faithful with us, not only from the seminary years, but for some of us who've known each other before seminary, to see how God has led us along this calling, to lead us along this journey of faith, not only vocationally, but avocationally, and how God brings people into our lives. How God brought Ellen into my life kind of is part of that story as well. And that's been a very important part of my ministry, is that cohort. As I said, I've had 2 opportunities to serve as an installed pastor. In 2011, Ellen and I were married about a year, and we received a call. I accepted a call to go to North Carolina, where I served as a interim associate pastor at a larger church called Mallard Creek Presbyterian. And over that period of time, in our time in Charlotte, Ellen was the installed pastor at a church, and I would kind of, as if Ellen were the earth and I was the moon, kind of orbiting around Ellen, serving multiple interim calls in Charlotte Presbytery. During that time in Charlotte, I had this opportunity to serve on the Committee on Ministry for 2 3-year terms. And I also had a great joy to serve as the moderator of predominantly African-American congregations, and sometimes as the Committee on Ministry liaison to those churches as well. North Carolina has more Presbyterian churches and more Presbyterian members who are African-American than anywhere else in the country. As I began looking into interim ministry and learning how to focus in on that, I began to understand that maybe God was calling me to this. I had a moment in seminary where I had a job behind a counter, and I would host visitors that came to the seminary. And I loved the job because all the people that came from all over the world, literally, and they'd ask me where to go eat. I tell them where to go eat. They asked me where to go find this. I tell them, and I was kind of like the concierge for the seminary for those visitors, except for the week when it came time for interim ministry training. And it was like the worst experience, where usually it was always so easy to help people, but the week that pastors came to do that training, it was the most onerous time for me. And so I remember thinking, oh dear Lord, if I ever get called to interim ministry, I know that I'm in for. So here I am. And boy, what a joy it has been to see congregations not only transition, but to see congregations transform, not by me, not at all by me, but within my role as we are discerning and seeking what is God's desired future. I'm going to have Brian, who's producing and videoing this session right now. He's going to show you a graphic in just a little bit, talking about how do we landscape this time of transition. And in the first part of that, you'll see in the graphic, there is an area called the past, the things of former. And this church has a great history. But at the same time, as we're moving in transition, we're not trying to say we are forgetting history, but we want to make sure that we see history as a tool, as a vehicle to help us move, not as an anchor to hold us in place. And in the second phase, as we move out of the old, we move into this area called the neutral zone. And the neutral zone is neither fully in the past nor fully in the future, but we're trying to figure out how do we discern what is it that God desires for, in this case, First and Calvary Presbyterian Church, that we may live out the call that God has not only for us as individuals, but for the congregation as well. And then from the past to the neutral zone into God's desired future. And in the graphic, what you'll see is that at the very end, each area has a predominant quantity of its own. In the earlier portion, it's mostly a focus on the past. You still see elements of the unknown, and you see elements of looking into the future. Then in the neutral zone, you still see all three elements. But then at the end, when you look into God's desired future, you see something really fascinating, that God is revealing not only what is there before us, not only questions, but also valuing what has happened in the past. Friends, please pray with me and with Pastor Ellen, with Pastor Michael, and all your staff, all your elders and deacons, and all the covenant partners of this congregation, that we together may yearn and desire what is God's desired future, that we may live out the call of Jesus Christ and his gospel. Thank you so much.